In this set of slides, I want to talk briefly about a second element of monasticism, which becomes the dominant form of monasticism before St. Francis. And so it's one that you need to understand because in many senses he's actually responding to this. Sometimes he takes elements from this and sometimes he doesn't. In fact, one of the problems sometimes of thinking about St. Francis is sometimes people treat him as if he just occurred out of nothing. But in fact, he's a part of a long line of thinking about how to live the Christian life. He's also responding, rejecting some elements of what comes before him, and changing some elements of what comes before him to his own context. So it's important to understand this context from which he arises. Let's begin by looking at Benedict of Nursia. Now, Benedict was an Italian as well. The area of Nursia that he came from is northeast of Rome. And he became a Christian and very much like St. Anthony, really wanted to live a life of a hermetical life and as a hermit. But he became very famous, and so people started to follow him. Some people actually approached him and said, "Will you be the abbot of our monastery?" And he said, "Sure." In fact, he was pretty strict. In fact, he was so strict that one group of monks that he agreed to take charge of actually tried to kill him because they didn't like his rule. So that didn't work out too well. He eventually goes on to found a monastery at Monte Cassino. And this, in fact, is still existing today. It's basically been in existence ever since he founded it, though it's been bombed a few times. The Germans bombed it in World War II. But he founded the Monte Cassino, and there he put together a cenobitic community. So he puts together a community. And one thing that's important about these communities is, just like any community, they needed to have what in Latin is called a regula, or what we say a rule. And in fact, it's what's called a rule of life. So each community, to be successful, would have a rule of life that would organize their community. In fact, you can think about in a classroom how a syllabus actually operates as a rule of life to determine how the community of learners in a particular class also functions. So he put together this rule of life. It's called the Rule of Benedict. It's often abbreviated RB. And there are, in fact, still Benedictine monks all over the world today. It's been a very successful rule for organizing communities, but it's primarily cenobitic. Now, it's also hierarchical, and you get this actually out of Pachomius as well, but it has an abbot who's in charge of the monastery, and usually a second in command known as a prior, and he also has broken everybody into groups, deans, and so on. So a Benedictine monastery basically has somebody who's in charge, and then a couple of other layers of hierarchy over the course of the community. So it's important to understand this hierarchical principle because this is one of the things that Francis, in fact, is going to reject, and you need to understand what he's rejecting. Now, some themes that emerge out of the Rule of St. Benedict. One, it's very kind of a militaristic theme. I've provided the open lines here for you to see, but you'll see, for instance, taking up the arms of obedience. There's a spiritual warfare element to the Rule of Benedict. So it has some of these themes. Obedience is very key. He thinks, if you notice here, that from the sloth of disobedience, the primary problem for St. Benedict is the self-will. We become slaves to our self-will, and the way to overcome this is by the practice of obedience. And this is actually what you do. You obey the abbot, who's then responsible for your spiritual growth. And also really important is the role of humility. He has, I think it's in, I want to say it's in chapter 7. This is just off the top of my head, a very famous passage on the 12 steps of humility. It's always worth looking up. So these are kind of important themes that come up with Benedict. He also puts together a program by which one recites all 150 psalms in the course of 1 week. This gets modified now. A lot of places do it over 2 weeks, but still they recite the psalms, and this becomes the kind of liturgy for monks. And again, you'll see this is something that St. Francis picks up on as well. So these are some of the themes that you'll see, and you'll notice as well how important these two themes, for instance, because he doesn't invent the importance of obedience and humility. He actually just adapts it to his own element. Now, the rule of St. Benedict ends up becoming the dominant form of monasticism in Europe. What actually happens is in the 8th and 9th century, Charlemagne, who forms the Frankish Empire, and his son Louis the Pious begin to want to have consistent forms of monasticism throughout the empire, and they actually use it to kind of help spread their empire. And so what they do is they make it the rule of Benedict, they adapt it, it becomes the official rule of monasticism throughout Europe. Also, in Ireland, you see some monks adapt this, and they keep this the rule of Benedict alive during some periods when it's particularly rough, when they're being invaded by the Vikings and so on. Now, it's extremely successful, but there does appear to be some problems with this. One of the problems is that what often happens is the local kings or princes would be the one to appoint the abbot. That is, the rule of Benedict actually calls for the monks to select the abbot themselves. What happened is the princes and kings would often create the monastery, so they'd fund it, they'd give them the land for it, and in return they'd say, okay, we want this person to be the abbot. Well, this means that oftentimes the person who was in charge wasn't necessarily the holiest person or the best administrator or so on. Sometimes they were family members and so on. So this could be a real problem where the kings and princes controlled the monastery, and so it became a tool for them to do the things that they wanted to do. And you'll see conflicts then between abbots and kings all throughout the time. So Benedictine monastics is to be reformed. Now, one of the first set of reforms comes from a monastery that was founded in Cluny. This is called the Cluniac Reforms, and these again are all monasteries and Benedictine monasteries. It's founded in 910. Now, what the bishops or the abbots at Cluny did is they got exemptions from secular rule. So when they were founded, the persons who helped found them said, you know, you don't have to report to the local king or prince, and this gave them the freedom to actually run the monastery the way it was originally intended to do. And so this is something that they did. And what they did then is they had this central house at Cluny, and then they would found kind of offshoots. They would found other houses that were then dependent upon Cluny rather than a local king or bishop. And so they would basically keep control by keeping everything centralized and reporting directly to Cluny. And this avoided the interference of kings and princes. And so this was a very important way of keeping successful. Now, in 1098, you have another form of Benedictine monasticism found at Citeaux. These people are now known as Cistercians, or what are called white monks. If they Benedictines typically were black monks, black habits, I should say. The Cistercians wore white habits. And again, they also found a way to centralize, to stay out of control of the secular authorities. But one of the things that they did is they would have, every year they would get all the local monasteries, all the Cistercian monasteries together at a general chapter. You'll see this shows up in Franciscan life, and they would also do visitations. So they would send monks from one place to the other to visit them to see that they were making sure that that they were doing the right thing. A contemporary version of this might be a university being accredited, or joint commission visits to hospitals to basically ensure that everybody's doing the things that they need to do. Now, one of the things that was important about Cistercians is they were primarily contemplative, and they really had two levels of monks. They had those who were doing contemplation, and then they had those who were doing work, that is, the work of the monastery, keeping things running. And so you get this division between one kind of monk and the other. You have those who are, if you will, the thinkers, and those who are the workers. And again, this will be something that Francis responds to, but it's important to understand precisely what some of the problems were. Now, the Cistercians actually become really important reformers in the church. And in fact, we know in Francis's time that they were very involved with the Pope. In fact, we know that when he writes his final rule, that the Cistercians actually, who were working for the Pope, helped him write the rule. And so you'll see these influences of Benedict and of the Cistercians in Francis's life and in the way he forms the order. So these are all things that come before Francis and that both influence him positively, that is, he adapts some of these elements, and negatively, in that he'll reject some of these elements. So it's important to realize he doesn't just appear out of nowhere, but there's a whole context of what life is like. And this is when we'll get to the life of the Friars Minor, to St. Francis, and then to the Dominicans, who are both responding to Benedictine monasticism in their context. So I hope that this will give you a little bit of idea of when we're talking about a rule of life or monasticism, some of the things that happened before we get to St. Francis.